Let's test cheap versus expensive chef blade. Cheap one! Very cool. Let's test cheap versus expensive chisels. And cheap one! Very cool. Let's test cheap versus expensive frying pans. An expensive one! Very cool. Let's try cheap versus expensive paintbrushes. Cheap one this time. Very cool. Let's test cheap versus expensive Christmas chocolate. A cheap one. Very cool. Let's test cheap versus expensive wire strippers. Expensive wins because of the extra function. Very cool. Let's test cheap versus expensive expanding foam. And it's a draw. Very cool. Let's test cheap versus expensive helmets. An expensive one. Very cool. Let's test cheap versus expensive mini blenders. An expensive one. Very cool. Let's test the cheap and expensive impact driver. It's a draw. Very cool. Let's test cheap versus expensive garden hose. A cheap one. Very cool. Let's test cheap versus expensive fluffy rollers. An expensive one. Very cool. Let's test cheap versus expensive shop vacs. And cheap is the winner. Very cool. Let's test cheap versus expensive paper shredders. And cheap one. Very cool. Let's test cheap versus expensive knee pads. An expensive one. Very cool. Let's test the cheap and expensive superglue. Comment who you think will win. It's another draw.